Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Alissa Walker is on the show this week. Alissa is currently the urbanism editor at Curved, where she writes about cities, infrastructure, transportation, and policy. Before that, she was the urbanism editor at Gizmodo and has written extensively about design and cities and architecture for places like Design Observer, Dwell, Fast Company, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. I've been a fan of Alissa's for a really long time and have just really enjoyed following her career. And I was especially interested in talking to her about what I saw as this sort of scaling up of her subject matter, from writing about things like typefaces and objects to buildings and now to cities. And so we talk about that and what it means to be an urbanism editor and how one writes about the, quote, city and all that falls under that. We also talk about the difference between criticism and journalism and activism and who she views as her audience or who she's writing for and the role of the critic in a city landscape like this. We talk about how she writes about policy and government through the lens of design and why we need more women writing and speaking about cities. I just had so much fun with this one and just really love talking to Alissa, and I think that you're going to enjoy this one too. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Alissa Walker. Want to be a writer?
I mean, I think in my heart I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
But it's a funny thing when you wonder, now that I have two kids, like how they know what their parents do and like what they want to be when they grow up. And like my daughter came with me to take your kids to work day last week, and I asked her what I did, and she said I type letters all day and I go to an office to send emails. And I was like, well, that's pretty much
I love that actually.
The life of a writer. Yeah, type letters and go to an office to send email. But I didn't really, I guess I did care a lot about telling stories, and I think that I wish I think I was always very encouraged in my creative writing with my teachers, but I wish someone had kind of said, oh, you could, be a journalist and be someone who created these stories that would have value to educate the public or, be an advocate for something. And I always thought of stories and writing as being, fantasy or just being, this nonfiction, reading this fictional world, not nonfiction. So what I actually did with my writing skills was I majored in advertising.
Oh, I didn't. Okay.
Seems like, yeah.
I did not know that.
Actually, yeah. So I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder and went into the advertising program there, which actually was part of the journalism school. They've reconfigured it now to be part of this like new media department, which is actually very smart on their part. But what where I was taking writing classes and taking some reporting classes, but mostly these like creative, advertising type of classes. So wanted to be an advertising copywriter. Went to a school called the Portfolio Center in Atlanta, which I think is now part of like the Miami ad school world. And, got a great education about how to use words to manipulate people, not educate people, perhaps.
Yeah, right.
But really loved the creative part of it. But that's also where my interest in design and all my love for graphic design and illustration and animation, that was all from just being exposed to these incredible people who I was, students alongside with, my teachers, and also all the people they had to come speak and advise at the school. So, I got this like really amazing design education on top of my writing education. So it was a very natural thing to, once I got out into the world and realized that advertising really wasn't for me, that I would want to write about the people making this work, the creatives that I had admired.
So you started answering two of my other
Oh, good. Yeah.
other questions.
Because journalist, that's what happens.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you these two questions kind of together because you started talking about both of them. Because I'm always really interested in, or I'm kind of fascinated by people who write about design or design related topics, whether they had any interest in ever being a designer, or kind of where that interest came from, or how you approached that. Coming from someone who wanted to be a writer. And so that's the first question is, did you ever have any interest in being a designer, or when you were studying advertising, did you have any interest in that? And then the second question, which may or may not be related, is how'd that intersection happen where you realized that writing about this subject was actually where your kind of passion was?
I think it was very easy. I married a graphic designer.
Okay.
So
Great.
So that was all of those ambitions were, I can live them out through him now, which is great. So I met my husband, Keith Sharwath, when right when LA pretty much within a year, and he had moved there from New York and worked at MTV and went to work at Ogilvy when it was part of the big like design consultancy. So he was kind of living out the fantasy design life that I always, was maybe the agency world that I chose not to be a part of. So I got to see all the highs and lows of, that side of the design world. But I do think it was great because I learned a lot. He was also served as part of my education. He's been like someone who's taught me about who's doing great work and stories to report on, and who's doing the stuff that matters. So he's definitely my collaborator in life in many ways.
Yeah.
And I will say that there's parts of me that I think a lot of the things that I maybe write about, or the ways that I try to communicate or do things, are kind of more like design solutions in a way. So even if I'm just using words to kind of work my way through it, I'm often proposing my ideas, or maybe projecting my ideas onto the world. So maybe that, advertising and design education, really came in handy after all.
I want to come back to that because that relates to something that I was very curious to talk to you about, but I want to kind of just finish this thread for a second. So when you started, when you kind of realized that advertising wasn't the thing and that it maybe was more journalism or kind of writing about these subjects, what were the subjects you were writing about when you just kind of started doing this? Or what was your kind of way into writing about, quote unquote, design?
Yeah, I think, there was two things, this is way back. So take yourself back to 2002, right? 2001, 2002. So 2001, obviously a lot of bad things happened in our country. But at the, bad things that had already started to happen, in the design and advertising world. The dot-com bubble was bursting. All my friends were getting flown to San Francisco and then getting laid off a month later. It was just a really big mess. So a lot of people I knew that went into work at these places had moved to a city and lost their jobs, or, had just were the last person hired before, no one else was going to be hired. Then they lost their client. There was just really bad things that were going on. So I think for me, it was, I was interested in reporting on, writing stories about people who were almost going through that kind of thing, because I was hearing a lot of stories like that. You were hearing some success stories, and you were hearing some people doing great work, and how people were adjusting to this new age of, we're not doing print campaigns, we're doing internet campaigns, which was just radical. People didn't really know what we were supposed to do except make banner ads. I was really interested in how agencies were adjusting to this new reality. And what I saw, especially when I moved to LA, because I just moved to LA just to have a great place to live, because I felt like San Francisco was kind of a mess at the time, and New York was also a difficult place to live at the time. So I moved to my third choice, which ended up being the place I stayed for 17 years. And in LA, there was this really just resilient, very flexible, super creative. lifestyle, that you could kind of merge different interests into one thing. You didn't have to have maybe a full-time job. You could dabble in a little bit of other stuff. So you had people who were like artists, but also had a day job at an ad agency,
Right.
and also like painted murals or something in their
Right. Yeah.
neighborhood on the weekend or something, right? So
Yeah.
for money too, so you had these people kind of putting together these livings. And I think that that's really reflected in a lot of the work that was being done at the time. There was all this amazing animation work, all this amazing illustration work. There were ad agencies starting here that were really like bending the rules when it, as far as like content and how to reach audiences.
Right.
So you saw this, and somebody who was not from here would be like, oh, it's because of the entertainment industry or something like that. But I don't know if it really had that much to do with it. I guess maybe some of the commercials made here at the time
Yeah.
might have been influenced with like having great directors or production people around. But I really do think it was just because at the time it was a relatively affordable place to live that offered you some creative freedom in what you chose to do. So for me, it was just reporting on cool people I met who, lived in these awesome little studios, probably are too expensive for anyone.
Yeah, actually, I love that a lot. And I don't mean to now just kind of gloss over. I don't mean to just kind of talk about your early career and then jump to what you're doing now. But something that has fascinated me about you and your writing specifically is kind of the evolution of your interests or subject matter. You've written for Design Observer, and you worked at Gizmodo for a while, and Dwell, and all of these places. And for a long time, I kind of just in my head had categorized you as an architecture critic. And I don't think that's a fair... I'm not sure if that was ever kind of a fair description of what you do. And now at Curbed, your title is the urbanism editor.
That's right.
Yep. And so I'm curious kind of about that evolution. Was that a kind of conscious change? Are you kind of following your interest? Because there's also like a scaling that's happening here, talking about kind of
right.
small
like 2D,
design.
3D, 4D.
Right,
Yeah, right.
How does that happen, or how do you think about that evolution?
I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's following my interests, and it's also what I'm learning about the world around me. It's all still about design. It's all still about problem solving. It's all still about people using new ideas to solve a problem or make a difference, or it's all the same thing. But I think you're exactly right. I've just followed my interest through. You kind of like turn a corner. You're like, oh, there's something. My eyes get opened to something through reporting a story. I turn a corner and I'm like, wow, this is right in front of me. I should write about that. And then I meet someone else who's doing something really cool. And I'm like, oh, well, I could also write about architecture. I could also write about transportation. I could also write about smart cities or whatever. So it was a very natural progression. I will also say that the two maybe things that aren't that different from this whole journey is, one, just living in Los Angeles. Los Angeles started to go through these very dramatic changes,
Right.
and you did see these designers kind of working out in public all of a sudden, right? So they were applying what they were doing to help the city, or to beautify something in their neighborhood, or to solve a problem that was kind of bigger than their own studio. So that was just tracking the projects of these great people I had already been writing about as they took their work in public. And the other thing that I think is this like design for good idea, which I've always been,
Right. Yeah.
tracking and writing about. And we kind of started out with this like humanitarian design, but then we realized that the biggest problems to solve were probably, on our own block or in our own cities. And it wasn't like that we had to travel to these other countries to, bring them laptops or design a community center. A lot of people realized that they needed to help people in their own neighborhoods and their own cities and their own states. So, I do agree that maybe the scale is a really good way to define it. Like, I'm now looking at the big picture,
Right.
really, really big picture things. But it's still at its heart is just people who are trying to help people and solve problems that we all face.
Is the approach, is writing about the city that I'm putting that in quotes.
I know it's such a weird thing. People are like, you write about cities, like what is that? Is that just everything? What cities?
Yeah,
Which
well,
cities?
that's kind of what my question was going to be. Is it even fair to kind of like what
Yeah, it's like, do you like a line around an area? You're like, well, I'm not going to write about that. It's too suburban. I will never, cover that.
Yeah, right. Like that's kind of what I'm asking is like what defines a city, and then
Yeah,
how far down that scale can you go? Like can you talk about a specific,
right, right.
even though we're talking about it at this big scale, you could talk about it, you could write about a specific block or a specific building, and that still
Yeah,
kind of counts, right?
totally. I think, well, the title was actually invented for me, created for me, invented when I went to work at Gizmodo. Jeff
Okay.
Mena, who is
Yeah.
another amazing urbanism writer, when he was the editor of Gizmodo, he brought me on there
Oh,
and
okay. I didn't
was
realize
like, I,
you overlapped. Because I talked to him also for the podcast.
oh,
I
that's amazing.
love
Yes.
his
Oh,
work.
I did see that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So he was the one who brought me on. It basically was
Okay.
my first real writing job. I just freelance. So got my first job when I was
Right.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
36. So he brought me on, he created the title. And the idea was that it was kind of like within Gizmodo's universe.
Hmm.
We had like a tech editor, design editor. We all had all these different things. And mine was specifically to focus on the challenges of cities, because at the time you have to think about like, even a few years ago, it was still like kind of news that people didn't want to live in cities and people were moving back into them, right?
Right.
There was
Right.
like
I
a
remember that.
flight that occurred, in the last few decades, and
Yeah.
a lot of these cities have been vacated, and for all these various reasons, people started to move back in, which has now created a new set of problems for
Hmm.
cities to face. It's not the old problems; it's a new set of problems. So that was really my job, was to kind of track some of these design solutions, innovations, projects, whatever, that we were kind of facing the new urban dwelling populations that
Hmm.
were swelling in a lot of these cities. So when I came over to Curbed, it was also a really good fit because Curbed is really about what's happening on your street, what's happening on your block. How's your city changing? How can you advocate for good changes? Really, just making. I always say Curbed is about making you a better citizen. And so
I
here
like
at
that.
Curbed too, we have an architecture critic.
Hmm.
And then we have me being not really an urbanism critic, but an urbanism editor, and I focus on the parts of Curbed. Curbed is love where you live. So I'm the parts that are like on the edge of your property line. So like how policy affects you, how transportation affects you, how, all these
Right.
different
Right.
things don't exactly have to do with your house or real estate or a beautiful, gorgeous building. How these things affect you. And then I work with the city editors as well to, especially now in our new age of a new administration in the White House, there's a
Hmm.
lot more challenges to the frameworks that cities have set up over the last few years, and a lot of the initiatives that they've undertaken are not being
Right.
supported by the government when it comes to things like climate change and transportation and making of affordable living for your
Right.
for your
Right.
residents. So there's a lot more to write about now, and which is kind of horrible, but at the same time, I'm really proud of everything we've done at Curbed over the last year, whatever it's been, to help people be advocates for things that we know work in our cities.
And what I like about that is that you are writing not just about design in the traditional sense, but that you are talking about infrastructure and policy and government and kind of how all of these things actually affect the design of the city instead of just talking about the design of the city. You know what I mean?
Totally. And that's kind of like the part of it that is underexplored, under
Yeah.
criticized in a way. We all rush to write about the new museum that
Right.
opens in
Right.
downtown or something, but nobody is writing about this except recently. I feel like now everybody's getting on the urbanism train, right? So,
Yeah.
but we didn't write about policy that was, the zoning policy, or for example, that
Hmm.
is creating the rules by which we are not able to build enough affordable housing to house the people in our cities. So there's a lot of invisible design that's becoming visible all of a sudden, and there's a lot of people who are trying to maybe who have been trying to use that invisible design to, create bad outcomes in certain cities. And we can, by making it visible, we can empower people to make changes.
To me, that's the kind of design criticism that I want more of, and the kind that I like to read the most, where it's not just, let's talk about the design of this poster or the design of this new building, but how it affects everything around it or is influenced by everything around it, and kind of putting it into this larger context. And I think the people who write about cities, obviously yourself included, kind of get that. And I wonder if that type of writing and kind of looking into the policy and everything around it, do you think that could trickle down to these smaller scales? Like, was this new for you when you started writing about cities? And that, like, if you were to write about a building again, would you see a place for that to filter in?
Yeah, I mean, it always connects, right? Even if you're writing about any form of design, it always connects to something bigger culturally or economically, or, there's always something. And I feel like, I have written about objects and, I have written about typefaces even, there's been like a lot of things that have, especially certain things that have been created just for screens. Apps are a good example of how graphic design has evolved to solve problems, empower people, give people tools. I talk about things like, just a transit planning app is like the most wonderful example of design in our contemporary world, because it allows you to make an informed decision about how to get around, and can show you that maybe, driving and parking isn't the best way to get somewhere, and that you should consider walking, biking, or taking this bus is coming in 5 minutes, walk to the station and you've got it, So in a way, I think it's not very different. And in aesthetics do matter for those kinds of things. It is a user interface, and the way that you experience it, which is important. But it's also, I definitely pick certain apps and certain things to use as tools based on how they look and how they perform, in my hand on my phone. And then I think also taking the little things like graphic design that people don't think about every day, but the way that you interact in your city when it comes to like wayfinding, and it comes to even like murals or public art or things that you are seeing on your way to work, things like that. I mean, those are really, really big and important parts of cities, even if they might seem that they're, just small printed pieces that are, found in the landscape.
You mentioned earlier when you were kind of talking about what you do, that you're the urbanism editor, and you specifically said you're not the urbanism critic. And I'm curious if there's what's that line, or is there a difference there between criticism and journalism and, reporting? How do you kind of see that, or how do you articulate kind of your point of view on what you write about?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation about that recently. I interviewed Alissa and I, who was one of the founding editors of Dwell, who I think has had a similar path, just kind of broadening what she writes about, and now writes a lot about cities as well. And we did kind of talk about the role of a critic at this scale. It is, I'll give like the Apple building, for example, the new Apple headquarters, Apple Park. We haven't been allowed inside to write about it very calculatedly by Apple and their PR team. If Apple's listening, I'd love to come visit. But we all were able to, it didn't really matter. The design of the building didn't really matter as much this time. It was this context in which it had been dropped into the city, where they had forced it to the campus, the company, to build tens, 14,000 or whatever parking spaces. I don't remember how much, for its employees, and, basically built a parking structure that was bigger than the office space that they had built for the actual spaceship, as you call it, building. So that is, I don't know what, if that's being an urbanism critic, I'm not sure if I'm like criticizing the city for that example, but, we were talking about how we have to explain these decisions to the people who live in Cupertino, the people who live in California, other companies that might be trying to move to cities. For example, like Amazon is looking for their new headquarters. Like, how is that going to impact these cities that are in this like American Idol style, like, showdown to get these campuses, and we need to be able to illustrate the impacts. And again, like policy, there are parking minimums that required all this parking to be built at great waste and expense, to them. And so I think it's the field of architecture criticism, for example, is looking at the building and the aesthetics and how it serves the users, perhaps, and the materials and choices that were made, and if that space is successful for who should use it, I suppose. But for me, I'm the advocate of the person who doesn't use it, who lives on the other side of the wall, who has had my transit access blocked, perhaps, by the fact that there's this monolithic building in my backyard, and the fact that there's not enough housing being built in the city for its employees to live there. So now they're all going to either be shuttled down these private shuttles. They're going to need to try to make better connections to Caltrain. They're going to maybe start driving themselves if there's free parking available at the campus. So it's these impacts and how it impacts the city as a whole that I'm interested in now. Not just how it looks, although that's also cool. There's a lot of cool stuff going on there. But I want to be an advocate for the users of the city. And that's where I come into play too. I don't really have a background in architecture or really urbanism or anything, like that.
Yeah.
Or even design, I guess. I'm just hanging out here, being appreciative. But I want to be an advocate for other people to help explain to them what's happening.
That's actually really interesting, because something else that I wanted to ask you about was who you think about when you think about your audience or your reader, and who, not just who you're writing for, but kind of your place as a writer or, editor or critic or kind of whatever, that position you want to call yourself, how you fit into the user or the, I don't know, the dweller of the city, or even like the architects and the planners and the government. Like where do you fit into that constellation of people?
Well, it's funny too. I also interviewed Frances Anderton, who has a great design show called KCRW called DNA Design and Architecture, and she was like made this great point that we're basically the translators for the architects, because nobody understands what they're ever talking about. And I would say the same about policy people working in government. They speak in acronyms and talk about certain things, and nobody knows what they're talking about. So my role is to go and learn enough that I can, pass along what all these groups are saying, and so you, just as a regular person, can understand. But I also think their responsibility, especially now as someone who's writing about cities, and I tried to get into this a little bit with an essay I wrote last year about how men have been so I want to say this very tactfully. Men seem to shout their ideas very loudly online, in social media and other things about how cities should be fixed. And most of all of the conversation about how cities need to change, I feel like, has been about men talking about how other men screwed up the cities and they have their ideas to fix it or something like that. We need to get more voices into the conversation and to listen to each other. And so part of what I am hoping to do and write about and bring to light, I guess, is that it's been historically one very small group of society that's been making all of these decisions. How do we get everybody at the table? How do we listen to what's working, what people are worried about, what people are afraid of, what parts of the city can't they use for various reasons? And how to get those voices to, be shared with people who are the decision makers. So in a way, I'm also trying to push these voices up from, the cities themselves, so people who are in these positions of authority will listen. Yeah,
it's interesting, because when you said translator, that immediately clicked for me and made a lot of sense. But it also isn't everything, because you aren't just kind of taking what policymakers or urban planners and explaining it. You're also you do have a point of view on it. And especially something like cars and transportation is something, you've written so much about. This is a weird question, but how do you kind of find that balance between activism and journalism? Or is that even a difference?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm very lucky now that I'm in a place like Herbed, and even at Gizmodo, where I had editors that really encouraged those very opinionated pieces. And there were some stories that I wrote where I was like, oh, I can't go this far. I can't say this. And they're like, no, if that's what you believe, you have to make the case for it and you have to do it. And those pieces do very well sometimes because you kind of surface these angry feelings about things, or, I have a very particular stance on cars, you're right, things like that. They're very easy to, just get a lot of people angry, but a lot of people also agree that, they agree with me or they agree with my ideas. But then there are times where it's more appropriate to just report a story. I go back and forth. We mark on Curbed my pieces that are opinion as opinion.
Interesting.
So you do kind of have to wear both hats. You have to, there's sometimes I'm just reporting the story. I'm just reporting news. I'm just getting it out there, so people can make their own decisions about it. And then sometimes I'm taking a stand and saying we should absolutely be doing this or this. And I'm almost always right. Sometimes I'm right.
Is it easy for you to like turn that off though? When you are just reporting?
Yeah, I guess you're right. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh, I really wish I could say this is stupid. But you just have to, it just has to be with what's appropriate. I think with, a lot of stories, a lot of times I'm just reporting the news, and it's almost like you have to report on the news first, and then later you can put it in context and create an opinion about it. And it's funny because that's how the first like architecture critics, they didn't have anybody like covering architecture at their papers, for example. So, for example, like Ada Louise Huxtable, when she started out and was like this amazing, one of the first female critics and was one of the best architects we ever had. She was the one who was writing the news story. Oh, this building was built, blah, blah, blah. This is the architect. And then like 3 days later, she'd review it in the same paper because you have to have that context too for your readers.
I love that. I'm kind of curious what the topics or the issues in and around design that you think designers or even architects, you can kind of play with that scale however you want. What are the issues that are kind of pressing design right now that you would like to see either more kind of designers talking about or design writers writing about? What are those subjects that are important right now? And then I have a second part of the question, just because we were talking about you kind of shifting scales. Are there other parts of the scale that you're interested in now that you haven't written about? Those are two separate questions.
Wow, those are good. Yeah. Well, I think they're kind of tied together in a way, right? So going back to what I was saying earlier about this idea of inclusivity and accessibility and making sure that your work and your solutions are understandable and embraceable by the widest swath of the population possible, and going out and talking to people who will someday, or maybe who won't, who, users and people who are not able to use your products and your ideas and your creations, and figuring out why. And I think a lot of designers are getting really good at that. I've seen so many great examples, but then you still sometimes just really, especially in the urban realm, you start to see some really tone deaf, and I'm just saying that, I'm like, that's not a term I should even say, because people who are deaf probably don't appreciate people maybe using the word deaf. Right now, I'm realizing these are not good terms. But you start to realize how these solutions are not reaching everybody, and they're not usable by everybody. They're not embraced by everybody. So those are the kind of things that I would just encourage every designer to get out of your bubble. It's quite often a bubble. Take it onto the sidewalk, or, for example, is what I always tell people, like, go talk to people, go and engage with people. And if you're also asking about how that translates to, looking at certain design on a greater scale, I guess the transportation problem of this country that the country is facing is kind of the next big, it's like beyond urbanism in a way, because it's about this like idea of geometry and how we can't actually fit everybody in our cities right now, and how do we move them between the cities, right, in a faster, environmentally sustainable and economical way. So it's almost like the the 4D, whatever, 5D, whatever is moving
Right.
people around and figuring out the spatial solution. And for me, that comes down to, how we are redesigning our streets and
Right.
how we're changing the way that we are the vehicles that we're using, even I'm going to speak at this Sustainable Aviation Summit, in a few
Oh,
weeks in
interesting.
May, and that to me is like, it's like flying cars. Although I think we're not supposed to say that. This idea that we're going to be using the air in a different way, and how that connects to solutions of high-speed rail or hyperloop or all these
Right.
different other
Right.
ideas. And that's kind of what we're going to have to figure out quickly, because once again, these designers, a lot of them are
Yeah.
designers, are creating these new ways to get around. And it's up to cities and users and environmentalists to say, hey, we need to do this in the right way. So it's always that kind of pushback.
Yeah.
Um, and what my role will be in that next chapter, I don't even know, because I know absolutely nothing about this field, but
Right.
I'm going to learn.
Right. Right. Right.
Just like I've learned about everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but just thinking about cars, like it's always just funny to me, and thinking about kind of the future of transportation, that there's all this discussion around self-driving cars, but it's the same thing. It's still just everyone in their own. The way this is being pitched to us is everyone's just
Can you
in their
tell
own
people
car.
that? Can you tell some people that? If everybody told like 5 people that, I think we'd be like in a lot better.
Yeah, it like boggles my mind. I don't understand. I just don't understand it. That's a whole other conversation.
And that's one of the things that just we get so distracted by awesome ideas,
Right,
and
right,
we get so, and that's again, like, designers have a really big role to play in this. It's not just
totally.
what they're actually designing, but a lot of designers are creating the collateral for this kind of stuff, right? So
Right, right.
putting these ideas out there, it's like, let's be realistic, and let's educate people, and let's get people excited, and the future is awesome, and Elon Musk can send a tweet and everybody gets all riled up, but like, we
Yeah, yeah,
really need to go back to the most basic ideas about getting around and fix those first.
yeah. I'm with you. I'm 100% with you on that. My last question is, I'm curious who you mentioned some people already, but I'm curious if there are writers or critics or even books that have really shaped kind of how you think about what you do, or have kind of influenced your own approach to all of
Yeah.
this.
I mean, I'll point you to the story that I wrote recently, about the one I was referencing earlier. It's called "Mansplaining the City,"
Oh yeah, yeah.
and in part of that, as part of doing that research, I reached out to a lot of female urbanists who I really had admired,
Mm-hmm.
who had written great books or had done a lot of great thinking on the topics. And of course, everyone has to say Jane Jacobs, but my
Right.
argument was that, by everybody saying, oh, well, Jane Jacobs kind of invented this, and
Oh
it's a
yeah.
women's field, almost like urbanism and walkable neighborhoods and everything. It kind of gave them permission to not talk about more women who are doing
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah,
things.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I have an amazing book list, in that
Oh,
article,
great.
which you can share. It's all stories. It's all books and other things from by women about cities. And just some of the really smart thinking right now is being done by women who have come up through, have come to policy in a different way, and come to like urban policy and urban planning in a different way. And a lot of these people are sociologists, or they're urban anthropologists, or they're
Yeah.
scientists, and they're really approaching the way we build and maintain and fix cities, in a totally different way. So I will just give a plug for maybe linking to that
I,
article and
I
seeing
love
some of
that.
the great, load up your Kindle or your book list with some of these really smart stories and books by these women.
That's perfect. And just kind of related to that, one of my favorite recent pieces of yours was your piece about the new LA Times architecture critic should be a woman, and you kind of talked about all of these people, and I was really embarrassed that I only knew like half of them. And,
Exactly. Yeah. So
and
you
this
can
is
go on
like
that
my
article
world.
too.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, you look at the critics that are, at these newspaper, and a lot, I will say, a lot of the critics have done a really amazing job branching out beyond architecture. Chris was a good example, but a lot of the other critics have done the same thing of writing more about urbanism and transportation, but still like only a handful of them are women. And that's, these are white men who have had these jobs for a decade or more. They're amazing. A lot of them are great. They're my friends. They're doing a great job, but like, it's time for new voices to be at these newspapers, especially when, the local media is such a, in such a precarious situation right now.
I agree 100%. And I, like I said before we started recording, I would include you on that list of kind of these great writers, and the way you kind of approach this from a, somewhat non-traditional background. And I just love the work that you do. I try to read as much as every time I see a new piece from you, I try to make sure that it's added to my queue. And this was such a great conversation. I love this so much. Thank you so much for talking to me and being on the podcast.
Thank you. You asked such great questions.
This episode was recorded on May 1st, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.